CLO 5.1, total revenue, total cost, and net income. Okay, I want to start this lesson with a discussion of the basic vocab that you will need to understand everything we do. This lesson is taught from the perspective that you are a business owner. So when you have a business, there is something called revenue. Revenue is the amount of money that you collect from sales. We use the letters TR to stand for total revenue. SP stands for selling price, the selling price of the item. And Q equals the quantity sold. So the formula that you must know is that total revenue is always calculated by multiplying the selling price times the quantity. Now, we also want to think of the total revenue equation, how it would look on a graph. So if we were going to graph this equation, you always put quantity, the independent variable, on the x-axis. We can label the y-axis with dirhams. Now, if you sell nothing in your business, quantity is 0, you didn't collect any money from sales, so the graph will start at 0, 0. But the more you sell, the more you will collect in sales, so the higher your revenue will be. The total revenue graph always looks like this. It always starts at 0. And one other interesting thing about it that you're going to have to memorize is that if you want to know the selling price of the item in the store, then all you must do is find the slope of the total revenue graph. Okay, let's move on and talk about costs. Now, in a business, there's lots of costs. You have to pay employees, you have to pay rent for your shop, you have to buy your items, many, many costs. So what we do in this course, we divide the costs into two types. We have variable cost, which is the cost per item that I'm selling. Maybe I have to go buy them at the factory for a cheaper price, or maybe I have to buy the raw materials to make my items that I'm going to sell, but they have a variable cost. Then we also have fixed costs in our business, and those are things that don't change every month. They are things like salaries and rent. These are the fixed costs for your business. So when we write the total cost equation, we do this relationship. Total cost is the variable cost times the quantity plus the fixed costs. So that's the equation we're going to use to describe costs in our business. And if we were going to graph it, again, we put the independent variable quantity on the x-axis, dirhams on the y-axis. The issue here, though, is that even if I sell nothing, if quantity is 0, I still will have costs. I still will have to pay my salaries. I still will have to pay my rent. So even when quantity is 0, we have fixed costs. And then the more items I make or buy from the factory, the greater my total costs will be. So this is what the cost graph looks like. It does not start at 0. It starts at the fixed cost. And if you wanted to find the variable cost just by looking at the graph, you can take the slope of the total cost graph to find the variable cost. Okay, the last thing we will discuss is called net income. And I will explain it more, but first I'll give you the basic definition. The net income is just the revenue collected, so the money you collected from sales, and then you subtract your costs, and what is left over is called the net income. Now, in fact, there are 3 possible situations. It's possible for the net income to be positive, means you collected more money from sales than you had to pay in costs. So if that's the case, we say the net income is positive. We say we had profit. That's when the revenue is more. You collected more money than your costs. But the second situation is when the net income is a negative number, and that's called loss. That's when the amount you collected from sales was not enough to pay your costs. And the third possible scenario is when the net income is 0, and that's a special case we call the break-even point. That's the case where the amount you collected from sales, the total revenue, is exactly equal to your costs. We'll talk about this more in future lessons, but I just want to show you on a graph what's happening here. Revenue always starts at 0, 0. Cost always, so let me label that, by the way, total revenue. Cost always starts at the fixed cost. That's total cost. At some point, these graphs will always cross each other, and that's the place where the total revenue exactly equals the total cost. That's called the break-even point. And again, this is the Q-axis. This is dirhams on the Y-axis. So if you want to describe the break-even point, you can always look down and describe the break-even point as a quantity. How many items do you need to sell to break even? Or you can look over on the Y-axis and describe it as break-even amount in dirhams. How much money do you need to collect in order to break even? And if it is the case that you end up selling less than that or collecting less money than the break-even point, then that's the case where your business faces loss. But if you are to the right of the break-even point on the graph, that's the case where your business had profit. Okay, let's start off with just a basic question to go over the ideas. It says the revenue was $25,000. It means the company collected $25,000 from sales. However, the costs were $15,800. And I know that they are dropping down to ask us, is this profit, is this loss, is this break even? So really what they're asking is, tell me about the net income. So there is an equation for net income, and by the way, you should just know this by your logic, that the total revenue minus the total cost is the net income. So we will plug in these numbers, 25,000 minus 15,800, and we will get a net income of 9,200 dirhams. And since this net income is a positive number, we call this profit. Okay, let's look at question number 2. Emirates Computers sold 35 laptops. That's a quantity. Quantity is 35. They each sell for 2,990. That's the selling price, 2,990. How much is the total revenue? Well, I know that the equation for total revenue is the selling price times the quantity. So the selling price in this case, 2,990. The quantity sold was 35. So I calculate the total revenue as 104,650 dirhams. That's the amount I collected from sales. Now just be careful. This is not the same as profit. This is revenue. It's the amount I collected from sales. But I will still have to pay my salaries. I'll still have to pay my rent. I'll still have to pay for my product that I sold. So I can't keep all this money. It's just the revenue. Okay, next question. It says a shoe factory makes Q pairs. So we don't know the Q. And the fixed costs, that's the rent and the salaries, the things that usually do not change each month in your business. Fixed cost is 3,500. The variable cost is 95. So that means if I'm making shoes, that maybe means the rubber and the leather and the shoelaces and the glue cost 95 dirhams before I make the shoes. And then they ask, what's the total cost equation? Now just be careful here. When they say equation, we can't get an answer. We will get an expression that has the letter Q in it. So the total cost is the variable cost times quantity plus fixed cost. We'll plug in the numbers that we know. That's 95Q plus 3,900. That way, for any quantity of shoes that I make and sell, I can know the cost by plugging into this formula. So I look here and it looks to me like this choice. Okay, let's move on. It says a company makes 447 bottles of perfume, that's a quantity. Variable costs, so that's the cost per bottle of perfume is 30 dirhams. And the fixed cost, that would be things like rent and salary, 7,600. Well, now when it says calculate the total cost, we have every piece of information we need, variable cost times quantity plus fixed cost. We can just plug and chug. 7,600 times 447 bottles of perfume. Whoops, wrong. Variable cost is 30 times 447 bottles of perfume plus the fixed cost of 7,600. And we will get a total cost of 21,010 dirhams. That's the total cost. Okay, looking at this graph, it says it's a cost graph, but we should be able to know just by looking at it, even if it didn't say that it's a cost graph. Why? Because the total cost graph always starts at the fixed cost. It doesn't start at 0. And the variable cost equals the slope of the total cost graph. So let's look at their first question, question A. They're asking, what is the variable cost? So if the variable cost equals the slope is calculated by doing the difference of the y's, y2 minus y1, divided by x2 minus x1. And you may ask, well, where do I get the points? Choose the endpoints. This endpoint is x1, y1. This endpoint is x2, y2. So then we plug in those values, 4,000 minus 1,500 divided by 200 minus 0. We will get a variable cost of 12.5. Since it's a cost, it's money, I'm going to say 12.50 dirhams. So whatever item it is that I'm buying and selling, I get it for 12.50 before I sell it again for hopefully a higher amount. Now it's asking about the fixed cost. For part B, fixed cost, remember, is the starting point. So where's the starting point? It's here. This number is 1,500. So that means my rent and my salaries are about 1,500 dirhams. Okay, so that's the fixed cost. And then when it asks for the total cost equation, the formula is variable cost times quantity plus fixed cost. And if they want the full equation, it means we leave the Q. So it's 1250 times quantity plus 1,500. That's how you find all that information just by looking at the cost graph. Okay, this next question looks a little more complicated, but don't let that fool you. These are just, it says these are revenue graphs. So the revenue graph, you know the revenue graphs because they start at 0, 0. When you sell nothing, you have not collected any money from sales. So revenue graphs always start at 0. And then in addition, if you want to find the selling price, you find it by just doing the slope of the revenue graph. Okay, so that's the characteristics. Those are the characteristics of the revenue graph. Now, why are there two? Well, in a store, maybe I'm selling two different items. I'm selling this red item, and then I'm selling this blue item, and they have different selling prices. So the first question is, find the selling price of item A. So the selling price is just the slope. Okay, the slope you calculate using the endpoints. You do y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. So if we look at the endpoints, we've got 0, 0. That'll be your x1, y1. And we've got 200, 5,500. That'll be your x2, y2. So we plug in these numbers, 5,500 minus 0 divided by 200 minus 0. And we get the selling price for this product A will be, my calculator says 27.5. I'll write 27.50 since we're talking about money. It will always have 2 decimal places. So in my business, that is what I am selling the product for, $27.50. I'm going to skip down to part C. Why? Because part C asks for the total revenue equation, and we know total revenue is just selling price times quantity. So for this item, the total revenue equation would be $27.50 times whatever quantity of that item that I sell. Okay, let's move to part B. Part B is talking about the blue product, the blue line. So again, the selling price is going to be the slope, which is the change in y over the change in x's. And you may ask yourself, well, where do I find those? They're just the endpoints of that line. So x1, y1, this is x2, y2, and then I will plug in those numbers. 3,500 minus 0 over 200 minus 0. And I'll get the selling price for the product B would be 17.5 or 17.50 dirhams is what we're selling that one for. And then when they ask in part D, well, what is the equation of the total revenue? That's just the selling price times the quantity. So in this case, it will just be 1750 times the quantity Q. Okay, this is just a vocab refresher, and we need to match the word with the definition. So first thing I will talk about is, I'm going to actually skip down to the very bottom, net income. There's a definition for net income, and it is when you do the total revenue, how much did you collect from sales, and then you subtract the cost and you see what is left over. Okay, that's the net income. Profit is the specific case when your revenue is higher, your total revenue is bigger than your total cost, and that means your net income is positive. That's called profit. So where do we see that? We see that in part C. Okay, break even is when the total revenue is exactly equal to the total cost and your net income was 0. Where do we see that? We see that in part H. That's when you break even. Okay, and let's continue. Selling price. Selling price is the slope of the revenue graph. Let's see if that's a choice. Here it is. That's part E, choice E. And then variable cost is the slope of the total cost graph, which is choice B. Okay, looking at this question, they tell us it's a cost graph, but I should know that just by looking, even if they didn't tell us. Why? Because the total cost graph starts at the fixed cost. It doesn't start at 0, so I can tell you right now that's the fixed cost right there. And in addition, if we want to find the variable cost, all we need to do is find the slope of the total cost graph. So, in fact, the first thing they want us to do is the variable cost. So we'll find the slope. The slope is defined as y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. Where do I get those values? I look at the endpoints. There's x1, y1, x2, y2, and then I plug those numbers in. 900 minus 450 divided by 200 minus 0. And we get a variable cost of 2.25 dirhams. So whatever product is that I'm buying and selling, it costs me 2.25 to get it before I can sell it. Okay, that's my cost per item. Then it asks for the fixed cost. We know that that already is the starting point of the graph itself. So the fixed cost is 450 dirhams. That's usually salaries and rent. And therefore, the total cost equation is variable cost times quantity plus fixed cost. So we will have total cost is 2.25Q plus 450. Let me put a box around that. That's the total cost equation. That's the fixed cost. and that is the variable cost. Now, here's a new question. What are the total costs when 130 units of the product are sold? So they're telling us quantity is 130. We can look at the graph, that's about there. So we could estimate from the graph what are the total costs. We can see, I don't know, somewhere in between 700 and 800, but if we want to know exactly, we'll plug it into the formula to know the exact total costs. We plug in 130 for Q, and then I'll calculate all of this in my calculator and get a value of 742.5, so 0.50 dirhams. And that looks like about what we see in the graph. Somewhere in between 700 and 800 is the cost when Q equals 130. So it turned out to be exactly 742.50. Okay, looking at this graph, if I were to connect the dots, it looks to me like the graph starts at 0, 0, and I can confirm by the instructions, yes, it's a total revenue graph, and the characteristics of the total revenue graph are that they always start at 0. Why? Because if you sell nothing, you have collected no money from sales. Not only that, you can find the selling price by finding the slope of this graph. So let's look at what they're asking us. They said to find the selling price. So we'll find the slope. The formula for slope is the change in y divided by the change in x, y2 minus y1, divided by x2 minus x1. We get those points from the endpoints, x1, y1. I'll label this here. This looks like the point 200, comma 700. So that's our x2, y2. I'll plug that into the formula, 700 minus 0 divided by 200 minus 0. We end up getting a selling price of 3.5, or I'll say 3.50 dirhams is how much I'm selling my item for. Now it's asking for the total revenue equation. That's just selling price times quantity. So the total revenue equation is 3.50 times quantity Q. Remember, equation, you always leave the Q in it. So then the next question says, find the total revenue when 100 units are sold. So they're saying if Q equals 100, we need to find the total revenue. So we say total revenue is going to be 3.50 times 100. So in this particular case, the total revenue would be 350 dirhams. Okay, the last question they ask us, they say find the maximum revenue. Okay, the maximum revenue is always at the right side of the graph, is always at the end of the graph. This is called full capacity. It means we sold everything in the store, and our capacity in this case was 200. So if we sold everything at the store, if Q equals 200, we know from the formula and from the graph, the total revenue is 3.50 times 200, and so we would get the max total revenue of 700 dirhams, which is the very top or the very right of the total revenue graph. Okay, we'll do one more question. It said total profits of a small company were 120,000. Now remember, there's not a letter for profit in our formulas. Profit just means positive net income. So they're telling us the net income was 120,000 and the total costs were 165,500. First thing they want us to find is the total revenue. Well, let's remember this relationship that the net income is the total revenue minus the total cost. So in this case, we'll plug in 120,000 equals the total revenue, which we don't know, minus 165,500. So if we want to do a little algebra and find out what is the total revenue, we'll just add 165,500 onto both sides. That way, we'll have just the total revenue left over on the right, and we find that it equals 285,500. That was the amount we must have collected from sales. We then paid our costs of 165,500, and we were left with a profit of 120,000. Now, the second part of the question says to calculate the profit as a percentage of revenue. Whenever they say X as a percent of Y, whatever it is, that means take those two things, divide them, and to turn it into a percent, you can just multiply by 100%. So when they say profit as a percentage of total revenue, they're saying put profit on top, total revenue on the bottom, you'll get a percent, you'll multiply that by 100% to get a percent, and we'll find the answer. So profit in this case, or net income, was 120,000. The total revenue was 285,500. That gives us a decimal of approximately 0.42, which means 42%. So of my total revenue that I collected, all the money I collected from sales, at the end of the day, when I pay my costs, I'll be able to keep 42% of it as my profit. Okay, that's the end of the lesson. Good luck.